And we will be turning to the next section of Leviticus together. Leviticus chapter 21. When I think about our passage this morning, the passage we're going to be looking at, the classic song comes to mind. Everything you can do, I can do better. It kind of makes me want to bust out in song and dance, but I will spare you the song. You will get to enjoy the dancing as I speak. At least I've been told that if you slowed down whatever video we make and put music behind it, remove the sound, it would look like dancing, but whatever. Here's why I think of that song. Anything you can do, I can do better. The three chapters we covered last week, 18, 19, and 20, were directed to all the people of Israel. Everyone is included. And right in the center of those passages, we heard the Lord speak to Moses saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, 'You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy.'" And then we come to this morning's passage, Leviticus chapter 21, where Moses is directed to speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, in order to give them instructions that pertain only to them. And so let's take a look at some of these new commands being given. Starting in verse 1, we read, "No one shall make himself unclean for the dead among his people, except for his closest relatives." And then in verse 5, "When mourning the dead, the priest shall not make bald patches on their heads." Sounds easy enough. "Nor shave off the edges of their beards, nor make any cuts on their body." Then in verse 7, we find that a priest shall not marry a prostitute or a woman who's been defiled, neither shall a priest marry a woman divorced from her husband. And then in verse 17, we keep reading, "None of your offspring," again speaking to Aaron, "throughout the generations who has a blemish may approach to offer the bread of his God." In other words, what's being said here is that someone with a blemish cannot serve in the tabernacle as a priest, although they are a member of the priestly family and are able to eat the actual food and be sustained by it. They can't offer the sacrifices there in the tabernacle. "For no one who has a blemish shall draw near, a man blind or lame, or one who has a mutilated face, or a limb too long, or a man who has an injured foot or an injured hand, or a hunchback, or a dwarf, or a man with a defect in his sight, or an itching disease, or scabs, or crushed testicles." There you go. The word of the Lord. On top of these new instructions, we've already read in Exodus some things about these priests. Priests who would look physically different than ordinary worshipers in other ways as well. They would wear special garments made just for them that would make them stand out and look distinct among the people. The priests also had tighter dietary restrictions. And even in the case of offerings, they had special instructions to deal with their own sin. Instructions different from the worshiper. So, what's going on here? What are these extra instructions about? Verse 6 gives us our rationale. We read in verse 6, "They, the priests, shall be holy to their God, and not profane the name of their God. For they offer the Lord's fire offerings, the bread of their God. Therefore they shall be holy." And also at the end of verse 7, after the details about who a priest may marry, we get it again. We read, "For the priest is holy to his God." And so this is part of why I imagine the tabernacle in my lighter moments as a dynamic stage musical in which the priests sing at the ordinary folk. "I can do everything." Sorry, but everything you can do, I can do better. There you go. Sorry, I should not sing ever. Gosh, you guys have warned me. All right, here we go. Because what is being described here is a higher standard that has been set for the priests of Israel. A couple chapters earlier, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy," turns out is the lowest common denominator. Everyone is called to this. Which, if we just recap for a moment what we heard last week, involves to love your neighbor as yourself. That this is a baseline for the average Israelite. And that God expects from his people, all of them, that they offer him holy worship, that they live lives of holy generosity and holy honesty and holy justice and holy forgiveness and holy hospitality. God expects that in all of these areas of their lives, all of his people are to look distinct from their neighbors, thus pointing their neighbors to the fundamental distinctiveness of the God that they worship. The people are to be holy, we're told. And yet then here, for the priests, they're also told to be holy, but holy takes on some new dimensions, some new depths, or you might even say new heights. The bar seems to be raised. And though I'm not totally sure how one can be holier than holy, this seems to be the essence of what's happening here. The people, as an entire people, are to be holy, and the priests are to be in some way holier, or at least they are to be holy in an even more distinct way. Which then sets us up in our passage for the next level of holiness. In verse 10, we get instructions specifically for the highest of priests, the chief priests, with even stricter rules about mourning the dead. He's not even allowed to come near the dead bodies of his own family members. And he's not to leave the sanctuary when he's covered in anointing oil and he's been anointed for his work. And while he has all of the previous priestly restrictions on who he cannot marry, widows have been added to the list of prohibited bachelorettes. On top of all of this, the high priest would then appear the most physically distinct in that his garments were somewhat over-the-top elaborate, ornate, colorful, expensive, and unlike anything anyone else would be wearing. And so what we have here is a graduated system whereby the people are holy, the priests are more holy, and the high priest is super holy. Each level more distinct, set further apart from the last. It's been my experience that people respond to this kind of system of increasing standards of holiness in different ways when they come into contact with it. For some, this system makes a lot of sense. Certainly, there are some who are going to be holier than others. For others, it brings up a time when they felt judged by someone who had a holier-than-thou attitude. For some, levels of holiness seem incomprehensible or irreconcilable when talking about who loves everyone equally and desires the same for all. For some, they think of a time when they were held unfairly to a higher standard than others. And still others really like the possibility that they might be judged according to a lower standard than others. And regardless of how I feel about such a system, as a pastor, I am occasionally treated as though I should exist at some elevated level of holiness. Often, when I come to meet a stranger and they find out I'm a pastor, the conversation changes dramatically. Language will sometimes be instantly altered. Often I'll get apologies for having cursed or whatnot. And the person becomes sort of hyper aware of their behavior and try, it seems, to be at their very best behavior as long as I am present. A few years ago, it was common for my group of friends to say that I was pastoring it up, which was kind of funny. And we had a conversation about this a number of years ago, where if I ever started talking about faith when we were just hanging out, I was pastoring it up. It was as though these weren't normal conversations to have among friends, among Christians, but that's something that only a pastor would initiate. last week, Ken and I were joking around before lunch. He'd asked me to pray and then jokingly said, because of course, you're the only one here who's capable of praying. And while he and I were joking, it is commonly assumed that something done by a non-pastor isn't quite as effective or real as the same thing done by a pastor. Ken was poking fun at a strange phenomenon whereby if I am at a meal with other people, I will almost always be the one asked to pray. There are people who could be visited in the hospital, in prison, or in their home by every Christian friend from their church, from their small group, and if a pastor hasn't visited them, they haven't really been visited. If a pastor hasn't prayed for them, then real prayers haven't really been offered. And it's not totally uncommon to be told that the time that I spend in Scripture, in prayer, and serving, above and beyond my job, are to be expected for a pastor. The unspoken assumption is that if I weren't paid, if I didn't have a title, that I would spend an ordinary amount of time reading the Bible and praying and serving. Whatever ordinary might be, right? But I point all of this out to say, or to introduce, an important issue in the way that we read and we try to apply the Bible. Because too often we ask the application question before we understand what's actually going on in the text. And so what I've described for you, this sort of elevation of expectations because I'm a pastor, is a misapplication of this morning's passage. See, what we've done is we've noticed that in this passage there are these increasing standards of holiness, and we see leadership positions associated with these standards. And so we immediately then jump to our day. We also have leadership positions. And so we too also ought to have higher standards for those who fill them. You can see how this works, right? But there are two fundamental problems with this. The first has to do with this text itself, and the second has to do with what then happens when we get to the New Testament. So let's take a look at this text and consider it. It is a set of instructions for a priesthood, for the priesthood. The priesthood, which according to the story that we have been reading, is not God's intention for Israel. The priesthood is a concession by God that he has given them because of their stubbornness. God has given Israel priests, not because he wants them to have priests, but because he wants them to be priests. And they said that they wanted to be priests, but at every point in the journey, they have resisted doing what priests do. In other words, God has given them the priesthood to teach Israel what he wanted for all of them to be in the very first place. So the law functions as a teacher. But how does the law teach a stubborn people about God's intentions and the things that God values? And I want to take a look at two examples from something in our own culture, something in our own laws, so that we can see the way that a law communicates value. Some of you may be aware of just recently in the NFL. The NFL has been highly criticized because of its suspension of one of its players, Ray Rice. He got suspended for 2 games. Before him, players have been suspended for 4 games, 5 games, and more for doing things like getting around a college football suspension and getting into the league early, breaking the league's drug policy. So Ray Rice is arrested, he's indicted, and he's disciplined in a court of law for knocking out his fiancée unconscious. And the NFL suspended him for 2 games, compared with 4 games for another player who had a drug infraction. So whether the NFL intends to or not, part of the reason they've been criticized is that they are teaching their players and they are teaching their fans a set of values. Drug use is a worse offense than domestic abuse. That's one example. Another might be to look at our Constitution. When a nation's supreme legal document gives instructions for counting people. And some people are counted at 3/5 the value of other people. You can see the foundations of a country that values economic gain more than the people that keep the economy running. Right? So you can see by looking at the structure of the laws, the ways in which it teaches particular values. In each of these instances, the regulations that have been set in place, they teach those under the regulations something about the values of that organization, that governing body, that people. And so we ask, how does the priesthood then? If God has given the priesthood as a means of teaching Israel, how does this priesthood with its holiness standards, how does it teach us about God's intentions? Well, the most important thing for us to notice is that the standards aren't tied to position as much as they are tied to proximity. So let me say that another way. It's not that the priests are held to a higher standard because they are called priests. They are held to a higher standard because their proximity to God in the tabernacle. And likewise with the high priest, it is his proximity to God that results in higher holiness standards. See, when the original Israelites, the Israelites were originally told that they were going to be a kingdom of priests, they said, cool, we're in. But it was when God then invited them to draw near to him, to move toward him in closer proximity to him, that proximity became a barrier. Priests, to be priests, must draw nearer to God by definition of what it means to be a priest. Holy is something we become as we are near the Holy One. And if Leviticus reveals anything to us about God and his desires, it is that God desires that people would draw near to him and become like him, holy. And yet God seems to understand that they are not going to do this. His people are going to resist his presence, and therefore they are going to resist having their minds, their desires, and their lives transformed at every point. They will resist being a holy people who exhibit God's holy character. And so God gives them a different way of being holy. It is going to be in their visible strangeness, with their strange clothes and diets and festivals and worship, that they will draw the nations to God. It seems out of perhaps curiosity. It's interesting to note that the higher standards given to the priests don't deal with morality. The extra commands given to them result mostly in making them more visibly distinct from those further away from God's presence. What's striking about this is that from a moral standpoint then, ordinary people, the people of Israel, are held to an incredibly high moral standard. They are supposed to desire to draw near to God, and they are to love their neighbors as they do themselves. The entire law is summed up in this, Jesus would tell us. And as I said then earlier, as we shift and begin to look at then how the New Testament begins to understand the priesthood and what's happening here and what's happened in light of Jesus, the New Testament should affect the way that we understand these laws. And the most clear reason we have for refusing to maintain different standards of holiness among us is that we are not a kingdom of priests. We are not a kingdom with priests. We are a kingdom of priests. Those prepositions make a big difference. We are, as both Peter and then John in the book of Revelation tell us, we are a kingdom of priests. What this means is that by trusting Jesus, we have accepted God's invitation to draw near to him, to abide in him, to seek his voice in the scriptures and to obey it, so that we might live as God's priestly people in this world, mediating his words and his presence to the ends of the earth. This is the mission for which we've been called. This is the work in front of us. The church then does not have a class of people, a position, or some regulated proximity whereby some of us can draw nearer to God than others. Saints, or literally the holy ones, is the common term used throughout the New Testament to refer to all of God's people. When we get in the New Testament to Timothy and Titus, we find what seem to be standards for leaders in the church. But I want to suggest that we're not getting standards for leaders. See, because the standards that are being described in Timothy and Titus are the standards for all of God's people. Those who are put in leadership in God's church are not those who are going to be held to a higher standard. Those who are put in leadership are those who have already sought to live out God's single standard of holiness. They are those who are already living lives that imitate Jesus and embody his holiness. So if then we look at leaders, and it appears for some reason that there are multiple standards of holiness, it's not that leaders are being held to a higher standard. It's that many will settle for less than God's standard for holiness. Because listen to this list of qualifications in 1 Timothy for an overseer. He says, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, but not a lover of money. This isn't a super holiness described here. This is a Jesus holiness that every single one of us has been called to. And if we happen to look around us and see some among us striving toward this and embodying it, then the New Testament suggests that we ought to affirm these people and perhaps even follow them and imitate them so that our lives might begin to also embody the holiness of Jesus. When Paul calls all of God's people saints, he does so sort of strategically. Are all of God's people living lives worthy of the calling to which they've been called? Of course not. We know that when we read some of Paul's letters. But Paul's not going to stop expecting those who will settle for less to rise to the occasion. When Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ, he's not being ironic or playful or facetious or metaphorical. And most important, he's not being holier than thou. What Paul is doing is he is inviting people to draw near to God through Jesus, as God has invited us to do. Paul's then inviting people to come and to have their minds and their desires and their lives transformed. Paul is inviting people into a life of holiness, seen most visibly in our love for our neighbors. Here is the beautiful way the New Testament applies the priesthood and its graduated holiness to us. When we draw near to God, we are made able to be his priests in the world. We are able to announce with our mouths the truth that God has offered his Son so that the world might be reconciled to him. As priests, we speak God's truth and we invite the world to come and to seek and to find the God that we proclaim and in whom we have found our life. But more than just being priests, we are also an offering. If we have been with God and we are being transformed by this God who would give his Son as an offering for us, we can't help but then turn toward the world and begin to give our lives away as an offering. When we lay down our lives for others, we give ourselves as this very kind of offering. And in this, we do more than just speak about God, but we demonstrate God's love, carrying it in our very bodies. This kind of love, this kind of life, doesn't have room for differing holiness standards. because there is only one standard, and that is Jesus. And it is his example that we seek to imitate, because every one of us have been called to be priests, offering our very lives for the sake of God's expanding kingdom.